buenos días a todas y a todos. Good morning to everyone. And welcome to our panel discussion on corporate climate engagement. Last year, the Task Force on Net Zero Policy did an examination of policies around the G20 countries on large companies and financial institutions, looking at all the types of policies, direct or indirect policies, that they are there to support companies and financial institutions into implementing credible transition pathways. And what was really, really interesting is that the two areas where we identify less policy development were interesting enough on when it comes to disclosures, transparency, and accountability on corporate lobbying on one hand, and the other hand on phasing out fossil fuels. And this didn't come as a surprise on one hand, didn't come as a surprise. And this year, we updated our research and we did a deep dive together with Influence Map on corporate engagement and the policies, trying to get companies to be much more transparent and at the same time to have that their engagements and lobbying practices are aligned with their transition plans and their climate commitments. We identified that only two jurisdictions in the world, the EU and India, actually have embedded in their sustainability reporting requirements about disclosing their corporate engagement activities and policies. But, however, and for those of us that are coming from Europe and who spend quite a lot of time in Brussels, interesting enough, despite those policies being implemented, the reality is that last year, starting in December 2024, we've seen an incredible, shameless, lobbying by some companies, by some industries, in particularly the car industry, the heavy industries, of course the oil and gas industries, and the trade associations. So one could start questioning the extent to which those disclosures are really helping, and the extent to which maybe we need to start shifting our attention to the governance and transparency of trade associations. Now, today is a slightly sad day for Europe, because we just learned that the European Parliament has literally dismantled the due diligence directive, and that means also, companies will no longer be required to adopt and implement a transition plan. And this comes at a time when we hear news from the UK, from Australia, from Japan, from so many other jurisdictions that are moving just in the opposite direction to actually require transition plans. And at the same, so looking at how companies over the past year have really lobbied really, really hard, some companies I should say, the European Commission and the Parliament, it's no surprise that this push for what it is wrongly called simplification, which is clearly an euphemism for deregulation and dismantling of green policies. So today, we're going to examine a little bit more in detail what are actually those practices, what are the policies that they are being implemented, and the extent to which, as I said, I already hinted to the conclusion, right, are being effective, and what is it needed. And for that, we have a really great lineup. We have Dylan, who is the CEO of Influence Map, who have been working on this area for how long, Dylan?
10 years exactly.
10 years. And we thank very much for all the work that he has done and the collaboration with the Task Force on Net Zero. We have Fiona Dugan, Global Sustainability Senior Management at Unilever, and we have Nathan Fabian, the Chief Sustainable Systems Officers at PRI, but also the Head of Secretariat at the task force. And how we're going to run the session is that first we're going to have a presentation by Dylan, and then we'll have a discussion between ourselves. With that, I'm going to pass it over to you, Dylan.
Thank you, Helena, and thanks for the opportunity to join this panel, and it's great to be working with the Net Zero Policy Task Force and inputting into your upcoming report. And I mentioned we've been working on this topic for 10 years, and everyone on this panel I think we've been working with for almost that length of time, so it's great to be kind of reunited. This really is a Amazonia COP with the noise and the humidity. Anyway, I'd like to comment on our results that fed in, latest results that fed into that. But beforehand, let me just take a step back and explain why we're studying this topic and so worried about the details of it. And I'll make a few points that string together that importance. So first off, Influence Map. We are an independent think tank, mostly based on data and research that feeds into a whole bunch of processes, investors, civil society, media, and regulatory as well. We look to our kind of benchmark or North Star or whatever as the IPCC's findings on climate science, which cover policy, economics, technology as well. And one of their central findings is we're not going to solve climate and nature without strong role by governments and regulators, including binding policy. We can't get there with voluntary corporate initiatives alone. And so that's how we, in a way, score companies. Are they agreeing with this approach and all of the toolbox elements in a regulatory toolbox that governments have, or are they trying to distract it with other things? So that forms the basis of our scoring system. Another point is that, according to various UNEP, Climate Action Tracker, no government in the world has the necessary policy in place to achieve climate goals. No, in fact, there is one that we point to, and it's Estonia is the only country in green on that action tracker. Most are in red or orange or whatever. So the gap between where we need to be and where we are is and continues to lag in terms of policy action from governments. So why is this? Well, one of the key reasons which we look at is the corporate sector, which possesses immense power and increasingly immense power, has for decades blocked binding policy action. And you can go back to, you know, the 1980s and 1990s when the oil and gas industry was denying climate science, and that whole narrative that's well understood and well covered. What we study is all of the stuff that's happening from then until now, up to the present day, including the opposition to the omnibus, which led to its watering down and the vote yesterday or today. And this is very nuanced stuff. It's not outright denial, it's delayism of climate policy. And so this is something that involves the entire corporate sector, and it also involves their agents, membership groups like trade associations and third-party lobbyists. And this infrastructure exists all around the world, and it not just for climate. It's the way corporations engage and bend with policy to their advantage. In the case of climate, it just so happens that this is not just another regulatory issue that can be kicked around like a football. It's an existential threat to our societies. So it has drawn the attention of us. That's why we study it. But then we also work with a number of stakeholder groups who wish to change this dynamic that I just described. In fact, the first, how can I say, customer of our work was the PRI, and they were championing the need for this, and PRI represents thousands of investors, asset managers, and owners, but there was a small group, mostly pension funds, and also BNP Paribas, where Helena worked at the time, who were pushing this. Look, this needs to be measured in our corporate accountability programs. It's not just about the emissions and transition plans, it's also about their policy engagement. And we actually coined our work Scope 4 emissions, not in a trivial way only, but to indicate that it needs to be packaged together with Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and the business plan as well. And corporations need to be judged as a whole on this. So let me give you a graphic of where we are at the moment on this. Could you put up that slide? There it is. Okay, so this indicates the core of the problem, which is kind of could be termed the lowest common denominator effect, where when you have a problem like climate change that where policy can change the economic dynamics, the companies who stand to disbenefit the most, in other words, the companies with the most to lose, will shout the loudest and fight the hardest. So you can see those companies in the upper left where they have strategic engagement and low climate policy scores. You can see the oil and gas companies and mining companies, chemical companies, the heavy emitters. And they, for many, many years, have been fighting meaningful climate policy. There are a few companies emerging on the upper right. They're climate policy leaders like Iberdrola, Unilever, who have decided that they need strong collaboration with governments around policy to get their business models done. And happily, since we launched Influence Map, the cohort of those companies has increased, and I think it's changed the dynamics to some extent. But we also have a strong fight back from the upper left in recent times, which is not good news because there's a lot of stuff about their policy engagement which is very different from the concept that you may think about regulatory advocacy or lobbying, and I will go into that in 1 second. But let me just give you a rundown, and I think we presented this in our report to you, about how this has played out across the globe in the last few years. So starting with the EU, one of the reasons that the initial Green Deal and the whole EU Fit for 55 package got pushed and presented was strong support from parts of the corporate sector, not least the electric utility sector that brought a lot of other sectors with them. I've been told by many senior officials in the Commission that the thing they term as corporate activism helped them get that done. Sadly, that we can't rest on our laurels, and the other side has fought back in the last 1 or 2 years, and as Helena mentioned, it culminated in a defeat. Well, a watering down of the omnibus package, which we trace to many entities in the fossil fuel industry. Here in Brazil, we have strong but not hugely strategic support for strong climate policy, but they have a very good pipeline of ambitious climate stuff that looks promising. On the negative side, in Japan, they have 2 years ago announced one of the world's first green transition plans and associated bonds to fund it. This plan was riddled with giveaways for the fossil fuel industry, unviable technologies that like ammonia burning in coal power plants to extend their life, which stands to benefit a small majority of Japanese industry in the heavy industrial sector, much to the alarm of many non-emitting, non-fossil fuel companies in Japan who are trying to fight back. In India, there's broad support for ambitious climate policy, and that presents the government with a pathway for collaboration to do that. South Korea has elected a government that supports climate action, and there appears to be some support there. Australia has seen a shift with growing corporate support for net zero policies, culminating in the Future Made in Australia plan, as well as widespread advocacy for an ambitious 2035 emissions reduction target. Do I need to mention the US? I mean, we've seen, even without the current administration, we've seen forces in the US corporate sector fight and destroy almost every federal level climate policy proposed. There's a different story in some state levels, but I think the US example illustrates the power of the corporate sector strategically fighting any climate action. So there's a structural problem here around the lowest common denominator effect I mentioned, and that lowest common denominator in terms of the fossil fuel and heavy emitters, who are now not a tiny, but a significant minority of the economy, essentially getting their way on climate policy, is also manifest in trade associations, cross-sector trade associations, where they fight the hardest within the trade group to get their position, that then goes forward to represent the sector or the entire economy in some cases to policymakers. So it's a double kind of whammy in terms of the structural issue with how policy engagement is carried out within the corporate sector. I think I will hand back to Helena. Is that 10 minutes? Suffice to say, I want to end on a positive note, that in the last 10 years we have seen a strong cohort of positive corporate engagement. And in Europe now, more than half of the companies active in the region support strong climate policy. On the negative side, we've seen an uptick in action by a small minority, the fossil fuel sector, and something our data doesn't show is the level of strategic misinformation and narrative capture that's associated with policy engagement but by the sector. And this is not something that happens or is done by, or is even understood by the non-fossil fuel sectors.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you so much, Dylan. When it comes to lobbying, we need two, just to use the English expression, you need two to dance tango, right? Two for tango. Today, we're only looking at the role of companies and trade associations and the policies that are trying to regulate, their behavior and their engagements. But there's the other side, and I really want to highlight that, because I was talking at the very beginning about how literally depressing it has been for those of us who have been working on sustainability for such a long time, what has happened, just literally a couple of hours ago in Europe. But I want to share with you one statistic. I look at the registry, right? In Europe, you can see about how many meetings, the Commission has had and with whom, right? From December 2024 to April 2025, there were 5,800 meetings, but only 16% were with not a company or a business association. 16%. So the rest of the society got less than 1/5 of the attention of the European Commission. So I was wondering, I haven't had the time, if we looked at the statistics during the Green Deal as well, and to what extent. So if we deconstruct, we could say, during the development of the Green Deal, was it that on one hand the Commission was much more open to all parts of society, plus the companies who were really supporting the Green Deal were getting those meetings and were pushing, and what is happening now is that those companies that are pushing are having less meetings, and at the same time the rest of the civil society. I just wanted to put that on the table because I think it is food for thought, and I think today we're only going to see half of the picture, and we really need to think about what sort of regulations we need to hold the Commission in this case, but policymakers and parliamentarians into account. With that, I'm going to move to you, Fiona. You work for Unilever, and you scored really well on the corporate climate engagement rating from Influence Map. And I was wondering if you could let us know, what is your sense in terms of how it has changed or evolved lobbying over the past few years, individually as a company, but also in terms of your trade associations. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So the question was, let me see, let's try this way better? No feedback? Okay, we'll try this way. So how has corporate lobbying changed over the past couple of years?
Exactly, and if you have seen a polarization between the good actors, let's call it like that.
Well, luckily enough, I have some data on that because last year we did our first climate policy engagement review where we tracked our top trade associations to see how aligned they were with us or how misaligned they were, and then we double checked to see how engaged they actually were as well. And we've done 2 now so far. So we did one last year, and then our most recent one was in March. And we did see a couple of trends, I think, that were quite interesting. Now, I do have to say that it was just 2 years of the data. Well, actually, I suppose 3 years really, because the first one covered 2 years, and the second one covered 1 year, so 3 years of data. And what we saw was that in the last report, trade associations were definitely less misaligned, so less misaligned. It was up from 13 the first year were misaligned.
Global level?
Well, I think you can I think I'll give you like a snapshot of where we are, and then I'll kind of come back out to the global level. So you could see that they were now less misaligned. That's good. But just because you're misaligned doesn't actually mean that you're really actively engaged, because we found that 50% of ours were actually passively engaged. That's not good enough. And also as well, we're looking at the trade associations, and we're saying, okay, you say you support renewable energy, but you also support fossil fuels as well. And it looked like as if people were just pro-energy as opposed to pro-renewable energy. And I think that's quite an important distinction. And then if you take a kind of a step out, I mean, there has been some changes over the past couple of years. There's increased scrutiny and transparency in corporate lobbying, and that can only be a good thing. But I think we need to look at the results as well. So have the outputs really changed? Have the outcomes really changed? I think there's definitely room for more scrutiny, definitely room for more transparency, because, we're sitting here in COP30 and we're talking about maybe a very prosaic process here. We're talking about, disclosure. We're talking about corporate responsible lobbying. But really what we're trying to do is make sure we're all on track for 1.5. And we're seeing the data that's coming out, and we're not on track for 1.5. So something certainly has to give. So I don't really need to kind of go into too much the detail of the trends to say there's definitely some type of disconnect, and we do need to sort that out. But from a Unilever perspective, it makes sense for us to lobby responsibly for many, many different reasons, planetary boundary, of course, but also due to our business case as well. I'm quite happy that I've got Nathan beside me, because I was going to quote some PRI stats, actually. Last year, I think you surveyed 400 of your investors, and 2/3 of them said that absolutely sustainability is a value driver. It's good for trust, good for customer trust, good for risk mitigation and innovation, and we're certainly seeing that as well. Everything we do from a corporate responsible lobbying point of view has to be driven by what we said that we're going to do. So we have a very ambitious climate transition action plan, and that's where all of our climate policies and priorities are laid out. And those climate policies are laid out because we know we need to keep on track for a 1.5 world. Otherwise, our supply chain resilience will not be resilient. It makes business sense to go with what we're trying to do. So sometimes I'm slightly kind of puzzled why others don't join into it as well, but I guess we have to figure out some companies have different aims to what we have, and I think we do need added scrutiny, added transparency on that. I think very relevant to what Dylan was talking about in his previous presentation.
Thank you, Fiona. Gonzalo, could you do same question but assuming Europe? So what's going on in Europe? Are we seeing a polarization between the different industries and sectors? This is a feeling some of us we have.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh. Okay.
But also within individual companies.
Okay, it's a good question, but I was thinking about this question, and I think what for me is clear that there is a growing political polarization in Europe. This is very clear. However, or we are also seeing that firms want, are looking for more pragmatic approaches. Why are looking for more pragmatic approaches? Because of the really complex geopolitical situation and because we have a growing competition. And for this reason, so I think firms in Europe, in general, they maintain ambitious objectives in terms of decarbonization. Not just for climate, but also for competitiveness and for leading the industry of the future. We want to lead the industry of the future. But what I'm seeing is that some industries and some sectors are really worried about solutions that were proposed that were not competitive or will not, or they thought that they're going to be competitive in the future. For instance, green hydrogen or biofuels. So what I think is that firms in Europe, in general, are looking for more pragmatic approaches from the European Commission, because we are seeing that this is a race. There is a global competition to attract investment and to lead. And in this context, what I think is that, for instance, electrification is going to be a pragmatic approach in the energy transition, because it's competitive, or it will be competitive, it can reduce energy dependency, and it can lead Europe to take advantage of the industrial opportunities. And we are seeing, for instance, that one of the main barriers are networks. But answering to your message, I think there is more political polarization than industry polarization.
It's very interesting what you say. It's very interesting what you say, because maybe we have a slightly different perceptions on what's going on within the industry, because I would agree with you, there's a general concern around competition, yeah? Give you that. And I think there is a gray area on industries like green hydrogen, you know, those industries who might have a slightly different view on how to decarbonize. But there are some cases that they are crystal clear, because when the car industry, German car industry, are just simply lobbying, you know, to withdraw the 2035 target of Europe of no longer being able to sell
changing objectives
combustion
creates
engine.
uncertainty.
I personally think that they are actually acting against their own interests, and we've seen how the delay in some of the policies that were intended to be put in place by the car industry have actually meant in practice that they have lost the train of innovation of electric vehicles. So I think there is a fine line between that, but we'll get back to you in a minute, Gonzalo. Nathan, Dylan was saying at the very beginning how you were, the PRI was the first actually to start using and asking for the data on influence map and start, and you also were engaged on the Climate Action 100 Plus, where we included, indicators on how companies were doing in terms of their corporate climate policies and practices. Why are investors so interested in this?
Thank you, Helena. Am I coming through? So I've got these in because I've discovered it blocks the range noise of the air conditioner, but I can still hear the microphone. So if you've got any earbuds, it really helps. All right, so first, thank you to Dylan for his decade of leadership and whatever led him to that point and allowed him to have the courage and resolve to do this work, because it hasn't been easy, but he's been incredibly influential. So thank you for that work. We're delighted to partner with you and always have been. Around about 10 years ago, we realized we had a problem in the investment community. We were going to be outspent by 20 times to 1 on lobbying by companies, because investors are managing your money, and even though investors are paid pretty well, we don't have a culture of spending a lot of that money on lobbying activities, whereas corporations' duties are a bit different. They understand their role as protecting their business model and their income stream, and directors' duties protect them on that. So we understood we were never going to be able to outspend companies to get system reform. So we start to look at our active ownership and stewardship activities. So this is why Climate Action 100 Plus had this component. We have an initiative at the moment called Advance, which is looking at human rights implementation, and one of the asks of companies is to align policy engagement activities with human rights commitments of the companies. I've got to say, a decade on, I don't think we've done enough. We haven't been successful. And so I think we've still got a very big problem here. So the recommendations in the report are good because transparency will help. And I think that one of the main dynamics we've observed is that companies who do want to be progressive or on the right side of competitiveness find it very difficult in shared lobbying spaces or industry association spaces to ensure an ambitious enough pro-reform message or to mute some of the stifling messages. We even see this in Europe, where energy users are the ones that I think are a bit of a challenge because they too have some difficulties with transition and the costs associated with it, and so they're often stifling, I think. So you're working against the opponents, if you like, on the energy side, plus some of the energy users, and this is giving us a problem in industry associations. So this is why we are supporting more transparency on how industry associations line up with individual company objectives. So it's not a very pretty picture, I've got to say. I could stop there if you like, or carry on. But just to say that we know this is still a problem. Investors still think it's a high priority, and we're looking for ways to elevate our activity on the investment side.
Nathan, investors have been engaging with companies for a long time, and could you tell us the extent to which actually discussing the lobbying practices have been part of those discussions, and the extent to which they have used their voting, proxy voting, to influence their actions?
Yeah, so investors can vote for directors, and they can send a subtle message that they're going to vote for directors or against directors. They're the main real engagement levers. Very rarely you get a corporate action where an investor, a private investor, might come in and try and spill or adjust a board, like happened at Exxon. And then Exxon knew we were serious, and look at the impact that we've had in US politics ever since that moment that engine number one tried to change the director profile on the Exxon board. So we're in a proper fight here, there's no question about it. So investors do engage with company boards on lobbying, but not sufficiently well. And I'll share an insight. The US government and the Republican Party is trying to pacify as much capital in the US as possible so that it can't exercise an active role as an owner. It's the largest capital market in the world, and the view is that anything that's invested through a passive fund or an indexed fund should have no stewardship voice to pacify the level of engagement by investors in transition. So this has been identified as a blocker, I think, an opportunity in the US economic transition, and that's why we're getting so much pressure on the US investment community around their engagement activities with boards. So, and again, it's related to the Exxon situation about 4 or 5 years ago. I tell you these stories because we're in a small, intimate group, and because these are the dynamics that we're dealing with when we try and engage companies on these issues, and it's why we cannot stop on the transparency and regulatory dimensions of this, because the normal channels are being stymied.
Thank you. Fiona, do you think investors have been successful in influencing or trying to get companies to have more aligned lobbying practices with their transition plans and their pledges?
I think they can definitely play. Can you hear me? Yeah. I think they have definitely played a helpful role. People do care what investors think because they are people who have their finger on the pulse. They know what the trends are. They know what the risks are. For us, we're very clear that climate change is a key risk. It's in our ARA. We should work on it, and we will work on it. And so if other people also realize that and are also talking about that, that can only be a good thing. However, I think we have to kind of look at the facts as well and say that we do need to go a little bit further. I think that climate transition action plans are wonderful documents that help investors see exactly what a company is doing on climate. And for us, it's been one of the things that actually we've gotten some pretty good feedback, and our shareholders have signed it off, and it's gotten some very good feedback. But also allows us then to go ahead and say this is what we're actually going to advocate for, what we're going to actually lobby on. And there's been various case studies on our climate policy engagement review. There's been various case studies about how we speak to investors on that. But we were delighted, and it kind of goes to show how much strength we put on this piece of work, is that it scored 100% by Influence Map. And I don't just say that because Influence Map are beside me. We were very pleased and delighted about that, because that meant that it was then aligned with the global standard on responsible corporate climate lobbying. So that means that what we're doing is good for not only for the business, but also a cohort of people who understand what climate risk is all about. However, I think, as I explained at the start, even with that, we do need to push trade associations to go further. And even with that, we do need to work more with peers to make sure that actually we have strength in numbers, and that actually we're working together on these big collective issues. So a long answer to maybe what your short question was, has it been helpful? I would say yes, but more to do.
Thank you, Fiona. We'll talk about trade associations in a minute, but before that, Dylan, our report that we're so pleased that you contributed to, Policy Matters, really deep dive precisely on the types of policies, that are being put in place in order to require companies to be much more transparent about their corporate practices. Can you give us an overview where we are in terms of those policies across the globe?
Yes, I can. So first off, let me just clarify why we're interested in transparency. If you had perfect transparency around all company positions, what they were doing, who they were hiring, and money flows to elected officials, if there was absolute pure independent information, it would reduce the ability of companies to lobby against stuff that society thought they shouldn't be lobbying against. It would reduce the ability to hire third parties. But we have nowhere near enough transparency. It's very opaque and murky, and various standards, some soft, some regulatory, have emerged in the last decade as a kind of a collision between the need to have more disclosure on lobbying in general, and then the need to have it on climate change as an existential threat. So it's coming at it from two angles. On the first, I would note that the first lobby register in the US came into effect in 1874, and they came out with the first US Lobby Act in 1946. So this has been ongoing for 100 or more years, but those laws have themselves been the subject of lobbying, so they are largely ineffective around the world. You have the EU Transparency Register, which is a joke, frankly. But the issue of okay, well, lobbying on climate now, how do we drive transparency, has now come to the forefront, and there's kind of 2 or 3 different streams that have demanded action on this. One is the investor agenda. There's an investor standard. It's not a regulatory standard, but it has some effect. And then you have sustainability standards, which are demanding that lobbying be part of a sustainability disclosure. And I think let's see, the most the EU CSRD still has a lobbying component to it.
Yeah, just that we just learned today that only around 5% of the companies that were meant to mandatorily report against the ESRS are now going to have to report on that.
But we have the ISSB process. I don't want to throw around too many acronyms, but that's on a global sustainability standard, disclosure standards, have included some elements of lobbying in their process, and that hopefully will be codified in many countries around the world. So it's a start, but not enough. Actually, what I would say, what would change the game immediately would be if the SEC said in its 10K or disclosure regulations, you need to declare which policy issues are material to you and how you're engaging on them. that would be game changing, because then for companies the fun stops. If you're in contravention of SEC rules, at least before the current administration, then the directors go to jail, you get massive fines. But that's something that we should aspire to.
Very interesting. Let me develop on that, because I was saying at the very beginning that for me, one of the shocks was to learn that Europe, apparently, when it comes to reporting, it's one of the most advanced jurisdictions, and yet we've seen no impact whatsoever, or very little impact. And I would argue that it's been thanks to investors, more thanks to the pressure of investors for Climate Action 100 plus, so forth, than actually the regulations in place. So you already hinted part of that, but could you elaborate a little bit more of what sort of overall regulations we would need in order to really hold companies into account? I'm thinking, yes.
Are you referring to transparency regulations?
Transparency? No, and even beyond, if you think. If you want to stick to transparency, you think transparency would be enough?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, the transparency stuff is really important, because then it forces everything out in the open. And I think the big change we need now is to make them binding regulations, either as part of financial disclosures or as part of disclosures as part of a transition plan. And if they're not binding, you see the problem we have. The riskiest companies refuse to disclose the riskiest information, and the easiest information gets disclosed, and companies cherry pick. And at least if the disclosures are mandatory in some manner with some form of consequence or penalty, you have the regulators looking at them, you have civil society groups like us and the media, and so it's much more of an accountability mechanism. The voluntary sustainability standards disclosures are great, they're a start, but they have to lead towards being codified, in my opinion.
Thank you. Maybe a different way of asking the question is, would you agree with me that even if companies are very transparent, if we don't tackle the receiving end, we will not really progress, or only a little bit?
I think the transparency will help in the courts, ultimately. And this is unfortunately where we're headed. And I think if you look at other parts of the Task Force on Net Zero report, we can see that even though many people like to dismiss the ICJ ruling, the depth of thinking by our senior global judges on how this is going to play out legally is actually quite clear, and that's what we need to pay attention to. So I think directors will be held to a level of prudence and diligence that includes impact on climate and impact on people. That I don't have any doubt we're going to end up in that position. And this is why a fair record is going to accelerate some recognition of the risk, I think, by boards. I don't believe transparency works as well in a lot of places. And I'm not sure if my colleague was saying sometimes we have more disclosure than we need, and that's not as pragmatic as what it can be. I think that's a fair point. But on this point, I think we need to be starting to get clear about who's trying to assist with this global challenge and who's trying to prevent our work, prevent our progress. And so, unfortunately, we need transparency so we can have that proper discussion.
Thank you, Nathan. Let's start moving to trade associations, because up to now we have concentrated on companies, climate activities and policies and on disclosure. So I'm going to go first to you, Fiona. To what extent is it difficult for a company like yours within a trade association to really make your voice, heard? What sort of recommendations would you make in order to improve the governance of at least some trade associations, yeah? And what sort of maybe transparency trade associations should respond to?
Well, we're members of over 600 trade associations. So we need to prioritize where we engage and how we engage. And on climate, we prioritize based on the market, how important it is to us, based on the level of emissions that country that it operates within, and also our level of influence as well. So that might mean that we have a board seat on it, for example. We find that it's not that difficult to engage, actually, because what we do is we connect it back to very much our business case. So we might work on, for example, fossil fuel chemicals, because that's a very important area for us. So we might work with a niche trade association on that. Or we might work on renewable energy, say, for example, in a country that we know we need to transform our operations. Say, for example, in India, where we recently signed up to a very big PPA. But what I would say is that we do think that actually this kind of level of influencing indirectly is incredibly important, and it could even be more important than direct influencing, because as I said, we're members of 600, but we can't operate on every single issue. So we need to make sure that we know if our trade associations are aligned or not, and what happens if they're not aligned. So we have a very strict governance process on that. First of all, we inform the trade association why it's misaligned, how it's misaligned, and how we want to correct it. We think that it's more important to be constructive than obstructive with them. So we work over 2 years to say, okay, this is where we want you to move to, this is what we want to do. And we check in very regularly, actually, with our relationship manager on this. And if not the case, if we don't see any movement, we can take the action of leaving, and we have done so in the past. And actually, from the first trade association review that we did last year, we noticed 2 discrepancies. And as a result, it's all listed again in our report. We said, number one, you don't speak for us on climate change. Please make that very clear, and please remove any mention of us from the website, because we're an indirect member, we're not a direct member. You don't speak for us. And also, we're going through a trade association, an internal review as well at the moment. And there was another one that we had a discrepancy with, and we said, you will be under review as a result of this. So we are working on it, it's very clear, but sometimes it's better to be inside the room and talking in the room and making changes internally than talking from externally. You mentioned at the start that actually we're only talking about one part of the ecosystem here. We're only talking about company advocacy. Outside of company advocacy, it's so important that civil society is also raising these issues and is also talking about it. We're all part of that ecosystem. But for us, sometimes it's more important to be in the room than out of it. Also, speaking of being in the room and out of it, I need to leave this room because I need to go speak to another one.
Thank you so much, Fiona. Thank you for everything. Gonzalo, when do you decide that it's time to leave a trade association, that actually there's nothing that you can do, right? So we heard from Fiona, how you can engage, how you can really promote good practice internally, but is there a moment where you need to decide to leave a trade association? How hard is that?
Before going into that, I would like to say something about the importance of transparency of lobbyist activities, direct and indirect. I think there is an important leeway for improvement. However, in our case, the guidance of the influence map has been fundamental. And I think the influence map has a very good thing, that is collaborate with firms, create competition and collaboration, because we compete with Fiona, but we are great friends of Fiona. And it has a constructive approach. And this is very important to improve things. So in our case, the influence map identified a couple of years ago, some areas of improvement. For instance, in indirect lobbying, or lobbying with associations. And we have been working on that, collaborating with Influence Map, collaborating with other firms, because we are learning a lot. Miguel Muñoz, that is from my team, is leading this work. And I think we have learned a lot. We have improved a lot. We have improved a lot the way we inform about our activities, direct and indirect. And what I think is that in terms of associations, it's difficult because there are all kinds of associations. There are associations that are completely aligned. Imagine the corporate group in Europe is defending green growth, but other associations are associations where we have to be there because there are like business associations. And their role is, and how do they define their positions? What I don't think is that the position is defined by the lowest ambition. It's a process of negotiation. And in these organizations, we are working with the associations. We are working of other industries that don't share our positions in order to have a balanced and more ambitious associations.
So do you think, Gonzalo, that we need good governance, like a code of good governance for trade associations, and equally that they should be transparent about their positions in certain areas that they are critical material for society?
I think they are becoming more and more transparent because of the social pressure, but I think these associations are working a lot to improve their positions, are listening. We are in a process where all industries, they understand that they have to move forward. However, it's not an easy process, because industries, to decarbonize, they face a lot of challenges. So what I think is we are seeing in business associations like that is that they are listening to the demand and they are improving things as a result of the pressure, for instance, of investors, but also in influence map. But they are improving a lot the internal governance and the process to be more empathic about those that want to move faster, and those that are presenting difficulties to move faster.
Thank you, Gonzalo. Dylan, I'm going to move back to you, because there's clearly a little bit of like a gap between the perception that many of us have, right, and the results we're seeing, particularly as I was saying in Brussels, and the outcome, what we're saying, the discussion here of saying there has been a lot of improvement when it comes to transparency and that. So there's something there that is not quite right? Dylan, you have conducted influence map analysis on trade associations. Can you tell us a little bit more, and particularly trade associations in Europe?
Yeah, no, so Gonzalez is correct. The data shows trade associations globally, the number, when we started out, the number supporting climate policy in some kind of positive way was something like 10% or something. And now it's gone up to 30-40%. So it's vastly improved, as has transparency. And this issue of a code of conduct, that would be great, but it has to be driven by the members, because they fund them. These are not regulated organizations. They hold a lot of power, and it's shocking how much little accountability or data is available from them. So we would fully encourage members of these groups to push harder. How do you make your decisions? Who supported what? I mean, we've had contact with many trade associations because we meet with them because they're concerned about our scoring of them. And there's a huge diversity of methodologies and methods on how they come to their positions. From the most notorious example is the US Chamber of Commerce under the previous CEO, who was there for almost 30 years. It was essentially pay to play. So whoever paid the most got their positions, and all the other companies were shut out and asked to leave the association if they questioned it. So that's an extreme example. Some of the others are more transparent. We haven't come across any that have a voting system that then they publicize. That doesn't work really. But there is a need for far more both for members to look at and also for the public. And I would just add a cautionary note here that if trade associations don't reform, they will make themselves obsolete. Because in the climate change space, if they are trying to, or rather, if they are adopting a negative, may not be the lowest common denominator position consistently, their members will leave or not fund them as much. And this happened in the case of the omnibus, which you were referring to. We thought we were on track and businesses, and then we had this conflagration of propaganda from around the world against climate policy. It was seized upon by some big trade associations like Business Europe, saying in the name of simplicity, these regulations should be scrapped or weakened. And it's a very simple kind of message, and policymakers bought into it, which is, but the members who supported the initial intent of the omnibus need to stand up to that type of thing.
Because let's be clear, what we're questioning here is not, the constructive engagement of I disagree with this policy or that regulation. What we are really questioning is the push for a total dismantling of green rules. But there is a quality difference between one and the other. And the perception is then that there's been a polarization within the different trade associations and within companies, because clearly there are some companies that are being hurt more than others, right?
I would like to make one more point, actually, that yes, we've seen more trade associations support climate policy, but there is still a small contingent of fossil fuel related, heavy industry related, that are doubling down on their strategy to oppose. And it's sort of outweighed the positivity, because there's a huge element of their strategy which is around narratives and communications and setting the scene for when the policymakers act. And this relates to the role of things like green hydrogen, as you mentioned, the overemphasis of carbon capture, and propagating things like renewables are unreliable and expensive. Energy security, you need LNG. So this is flooding the airwaves, and the policymakers are not experts at this stuff, and it's very nuanced, sophisticated stuff. So this is an upscale, enhanced strategy from a small minority of both companies and fossil fuel trade associations that frankly has got the upper hand and has taken the ground. So that explains what your question. It's about the narrative and communications and social discourse capture that the non-fossil fuel trade groups and companies don't engage in. They think, why do we need to do this? Truth should come out, but it doesn't work like that.
So Gonzalo, you agree with that analysis?
No, what I agree is that I think there is not such a polarization in the industry. There is more political polarization. Of course, there are industries that they have to move and they are losers. But in general, industry in Europe, they are maintaining their objective of decarbonization, but they want more pragmatic approaches. And they were against solution of green hydrogen that were not competitive at all. And if they adopt it, they will lose competitiveness. Of course, there are some sectors, I agree with you, the car industry, but in general, I'm more positive, and I think trade associations, they are moving forward with more ambitious approaches, and an approach. It's not a minimum. No, it's an approach of a negotiation. So
Nathan,
I think I'm a bit sorry for that.
Well, I just want to say I agree. Having experienced business environments in different jurisdictions around the world, the Europeans are pretty good. The business associations, by and large, I found Business Europe, they've had some problematic positions, but by and large there's a reasonable dialogue there. The problem comes when you get the more extreme sectoral interests overlaying on top, and then when you get foreign interference. So American Chamber of Commerce and Industry, AmCham, has been very active in Europeans' reform debate.
Some companies.
So when you get a moderate and mostly sensible middle of the business community in Europe, overlaid by industry sectoral lobbying and then foreign lobbying, it gets very challenging for policymakers, and I think we've seen that wave of political influence in this recent debate.
Nathan, I wanted to just shifting a little bit the conversation and starting to conclude. I don't want to leave the discussion without talking about asset managers and asset owners, right? Because also the perception, maybe again is wrong, is that there is a division or increasingly gap between asset owners that think in long term, their fiduciary duties, and asset managers that have much more of a short-term pressures. Yeah, is that the feeling? I know the PRI has conducted some research on this in this area.
So that is right, and we do have some structural problems in our capital markets, and we're seeing the limits of a capital market function that was built for sort of the 80s, 90s, and noughties is not capable of dealing with some of the transitional challenges that we're facing now. So around half of global savings is managed without there being a trustee, somebody who's thinking about the interests of the investor apart from sort of a regular financial incremental change. And so there's a very low leverage from that half of global savings on stewardship activities on companies. And in fact, if you talk to the American investment managers, some of them would say, I feel like I've got a higher duty to the company than I have to my investor, my end client. Now, clearly, where you've got big transitional economic challenges, if you feel that as an investor that your primary interest is to the company, and the directors are saying, well, I interpret my interest to the company as continuing to earn income from what I'm doing today, and therefore I'm going to lobby to make sure I can do that, we've got this blockage on the investment side. So we are a bit stuck because the other half of the investment pool is managed by trustees whose primary duty is to you as an end investor. And so their judgments are a little different. They're not actually interested of any one particular company. It's not their primary concern. It's the portfolio as a whole and their interest to you. So, and this is why the American situation is so interesting, is that there's a big, real battle for which side of the capital markets, which version of capitalism should be dominating the way capital markets work. And so we've got this structural blockage. And so this is why the poor companies are like saying, why are we getting two sets of messages? It's because there's different parts of the investment community with different duties and different roles. So this is something we think deeply about at the PRI, and we realise that our mission will live or die by our ability to address this problem.
Thank you. We're running out of time, so I'm just going to ask each one of you to let us know, to tell us.
I've got to go in a minute.
Okay, go, Nathan, go. Thank you. Yeah. So, yeah, to wrap up, Dylan and Gonzalo, could you tell us your 3 top recommendations to actually improve corporate lobbying?
So I would remind that informally this is known as, or one of the terms is, this is the information cop. And there's a huge emphasis on misinformation and twisted narratives. So I kind of disagree with Gonzalo saying the problem lies in the political gridlock. It all originates in the information and narratives in which they operate. I don't believe any elected official really cares about being negative on climate. They use it as an electoral issue, and the origination of that comes in misinformation propagated by the fossil fuel industry. And that's what's caused the pullback in the UK and in Europe on climate. So we need to address that as the core rot in the system.
And we need to improve the European registry, transparency registry, and also the rules around the European Parliament. But that's for another day. Gonzalo.
I think we need to work more together. I mean, we would like to work more with Influence Map, but we would like to bring Influence Map to other, for instance, Spanish industries. Because there is, and we have to be more empathic. This is what I think. We have to be ambitious, we have to be pragmatic, and I think we have to collaborate more. We are really supporting. I'm also the director of the Spanish Green Growth Group, and I think we have to work with other associations, with trade associations, with everyone on climate, on competitiveness, on energy security, that are also drivers into this direction. And I think we will influence politicians. We will, because politicians, especially for more conservative and liberal politicians, the role of firms are really important. So I think there is room for collaborating more and to improve the situation.
Right. Thank you so much, Gonzalo and Dylan. Sorry, we were running out. We started late. You know, it's really hot, and we had 2 panelists that had to rush to another event. But thank you so much for staying with us, and I hope that you found the session very interesting. Thank you.